We'd like to get started with our last and an exciting presenter, Daniel Johnson. I remember he spoke a few years ago on weapons. Metals? Well, but you had a little bit of weapons too. Metals and gold plates. Okay. Any rate, we're glad to have him return again and to talk to us about hard evidences of horses in America. And so I'm hoping I can ride one out when we're done today, since I have a sore hip. But I'm not sure I can get there. But at any rate, we're happy to have him with us. He's principal author of an LDS Guide to Mesoamerica and LDS Guide to Yucatan. Been interested to pursue interest in the Book of Mormon lands and has spent much time traveling there and investigating things. So we're looking forward to hearing from Daniel about his current research.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I must admit that I could not see the dog. So, and I'm an artist, so no matter how long I looked at that thing, I couldn't see the dog. But that's another issue. So I'm very pleased and excited to be asked to speak here today, and especially humbled given the accomplishments of the other scholars and all of those who have been here. So I hope that I can have something to add. Now, Brother Welch, I think, mentioned horses, and that those would be coming up. So hopefully I can bring something new to the table and not disappoint him or you with what I have to say here. So first of all, what I'm going to say, just to kind of lower the bar for myself, that I don't have any smoking gun evidence to present to everyone. I don't have horse remains dated to 600 BC that were found in the highlands of Guatemala. Okay, now that that's out of the way, we're going to talk about what I do have. Because I think I do have some hard evidence that should be considered, but we have a lot of things we need to get through first, a lot of misconceptions. So first of all, how did horses get here? There we go. So if anyone recalls this Far Side cartoon, this is horses being introduced to the Americas. So that's how we're starting out. This actually represents a common belief of, I think, most people, even today. More than any other criticism of the Book of Mormon, the inclusion of horses has generated, I think, more accusation of its supposedly fraudulent nature than any others. It's still used to cast doubt upon its origins. So, as we know, critics have long since pointed to the mention of horses as an anachronism and proof of its modern invention. Even in 1830, their inclusion seemed a bit problematic. But we should remember that the prevailing belief, and perhaps even more so in Joseph Smith's time, was that there were no horses in America before the arrival of the Spanish. So the question is, why have it there at all? Joseph Smith could have saved us a lot of trouble if he just not put horses in there, right? If the Book of Mormon were just an early 19th century fabrication, then it should not have any horses in it, right? So even though Joseph Smith made several corrections to new editions published in his lifetime, the horses always stayed in there. No matter what other little changes or corrections he made, horses never went away. So, there we go. Arnold Freeburg's illustrations notwithstanding, much as we might like to imagine that, the Book of Mormon does not ever say that anyone rode a horse or used them for warfare. In fact, we're never really told exactly what they were used for, except that at least one time the Lamanites had chariots and horses. I suspect that the terrain and the climate and many other factors in Mesoamerica made an old world use of horses rather impractical here in the new promised land. So more on that a little bit later, but what I'm going to go through is the types of things I'm going to show. I'm not sure how new they are. Some of them were new to me, so we'll see how that works. But critics have long attacked any sort of apologetic position or evidences that we might give. And while I'm going to be presenting several different ideas, some critics of this apologetic of the Book of Mormon have called this the shotgun approach. I guess take a shotgun, a blast at a target and hope something sticks. I don't really think that's a valid criticism. I'm going to show several different possible solutions, some of which are mutually exclusive. The idea is that I don't personally know exactly what happened in the Book of Mormon and what the full story with horses is. But I'm going to give you, I think, some good plausible ideas that we can run with. Now, to begin with, since we talk about the Maya a lot in Mesoamerica, archaeologists tell us that the Maya had no beasts of burden. That may be true, but I think they at least understood this concept. Thankfully, Diane Worth gave us a lot of information about three and talked a lot about the three creation stones. I have right here a Mayan vase. This is from the Maya vase database. This is care number 196. That's how it's marked. This is a mythological tale. It shows one of the gods and one of the three creation stones on the back of a deer. Now notice that it's tied to the back of the deer, and there's some sort of pad or some type of other item on the deer's back where the stone is resting. So this, of course, is a mythological tale, but you wouldn't expect the Maya to create this without having some type of practical, real-world understanding of what's going on. So when we talk about horses, especially with the Lamanites and their horses and chariots, another topic comes into mind, and that is wheels. And that's been a common phrase that there was no use of the wheel in the ancient Americas, even though the word wheel does not really appear in the Book of Mormon. So I'd like to address that. We're all familiar with little items like this that are found from Mesoamerican exhibits. Many wheeled items, and can be found in all sorts of places. But getting back to the wheel in a moment, I want to look at this one right here. There we go. That's a fascinating one. This item here is a rider on an unknown animal. Unfortunately, the rider is only half there, so we can't see more of it, but he's definitely riding on some type of device of some kind, like a saddle. Now, this artifact is described as a rattle. It came from Oaxaca. It's now in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. It was obtained by Marshall H. Seville in one of his expeditions to Oaxaca between 1898 and 1902. Those of you that know anything about me or what I like to do in the books or in talks is I'm a very visual person. So if I hear about something or I read about something, I want to find out and get a picture of it and see exactly what it is and where it is. So this little guy here, and of course the rider being the extraordinary feature, is classified as post-conquest. Why? Because, of course, if someone's riding an animal, it must be after the Spanish came with horses. However, I have information that suggests that these types of effigies were not made after the Spanish arrived. More on that in a moment. Getting back to horses in the Book of Mormon, references to them are kind of infrequent. In Ether chapter 9, we read that the Jaredites had horses. They were apparently still around when Lehi's party landed, because Nephi mentions them briefly, along with other large animals, and of course in 1 Nephi chapter 18. A few generations later, Enos relates that the Nephites had many horses among their flocks. The Lamanite king Lamoni is described as having horses and chariots in Alma chapter 18. And in 3 Nephi chapter 6, the Nephites still had horses among their animals when they returned to their lands after dealing with Gadianton robbers. The last mention of horses in the Book of Mormon is around AD 26, well before, of course, most surviving artifacts and writing we have from the Mesoamerican area. So AD 26, there's no need to have them after that point because the Book of Mormon doesn't mention them. All right, so getting back to this idea of the wheel, if these wheeled animals are here, what would a wheel be for? Now, we have, of course, the Lamanite idea of horses and chariots. Do chariots have to have wheels? You know, I'm not sure we know exactly what the Lamanite horses and chariots were. But as far as the problem with wheels in ancient America, there is a guy named Tim McGinnis who's a PhD. He actually was instrumental in the development of personal computers and has since turned his attention to hobbies like archaeology and has some really interesting websites up now about things like ancient wheels and metal artifacts and so on. As far as describing why we don't see real artifacts of wheels from these times, he gives this as one suggestion. Wheels might have been in limited use, but the technology was lost and no artifacts remain. It is known that warfare was widespread throughout ancient America, in Mesoamerica, and in the Andean regions of South America especially. It is probable that numerous advances in technology were lost, as the artisans that developed them were overrun and killed or made captive. This may be one of the reasons we see sophisticated crafts devolve into more primitive, as occurred in many regions. If there were limited wheel makers, they may have expired before being able to spread the knowledge needed. But remember, this is speculation. Now, I guess it's okay for him to say this because he's not LDS, but if an LDS apologist were to say something like this, he would be quite strongly attacked by the critics. So, moving on here, I've got some information from Gordon Ekholm. And Gordon Ekholm was Curator Emeritus of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History, no longer alive. He was an authority on pre-Columbian archaeology of Mexico and Central America. In 1949, he displayed at the museum a graphic and a detailed exhibition that showed parallels between advanced cultures in southern and eastern Asia and the Maya civilization. He suggested that the Maya's ancestors had perhaps migrated across the Atlantic. Isn't that a crazy idea? And in a paper called Wheeled Toys in Mexico, printed in American Antiquity in 1946, he writes, "In my opinion, the evidence to be presented indicates that the Indians of Mexico had some knowledge of the principle of the wheel in pre-conquest times. This will come as a surprise to many, because the supposed absence of any knowledge of this principle in the New World has often been stressed in discussions concerning the origin of the American Indian and his cultures. It is held that the absence of the wheel is proof that contact with the developed cultures of the Old World could not have occurred, and that the higher aspects of the New World cultures must have been autochthonous developments." I think he says that means they happened all by themselves without any outside influence. This argument is not necessarily nullified by the finding of wheeled toys in Mexico, but because of them, it certainly cannot be used without some reservation. Now, in some more recent articles, the idea of toys, Diane Wirth has suggested that these things weren't really toys because of the places that they were found, where they were buried. They must have been something else. So, no longer calling them toys, it's a bit more fashionable to call them effigies. So I've got a paper here called Tula and Wheeled Animal Effigies in Mesoamerica by Richard A. Deal and Margaret Mandeville from 1987. And they actually talk about what they call composite types of wheeled vehicles, such as that, in which you have animals or humans mounted on wheeled platforms. Some examples come from El Salvador. They are kind of rare. This one is in the LA County Museum of Art. It's from Veracruz and dated from AD 450 to 650. So they also say that most, if not all, wheeled figurines were manufactured during the early post-classic or before. There's no evidence to support that they were made after 1250, and they were no longer being made at the time of the Spanish conquest. So where does that leave us with the one that shows the rider on the back of some animal? I'll leave you to go with that. Interestingly, they also say, ironically, until the end of the Pleistocene, Mesoamerica did contain large animals which could have been domesticated. Horses, camels, and even elephant forms inhabited Mexico and Central America until the Paleo-Indian hunted them to extinction. Did the Paleo-Indian really hunt them to extinction? I'll get back to that in a moment. Further south in the Andes, there were llamas and alpacas which might have pulled wheeled vehicles. Now, back to Gordon Ekholm, he actually says that when we consider the various kinds of miniatures or toys found in primitive cultures of the world, we see a nearly universal use of dolls, which are miniatures of people or animals, and of miniatures of various manufactured objects common to everyday life. Here's the important part. It is uncommon to find toys or models that involve principles which could have been put into use in cultures where they are not so used. What he's saying is it's very unusual to find that they would make small items like this, but not make the real full-size functioning item. So he even says, it is within the realm of possibility that the toy vehicles of Mexico are the result of contact with or influence from some old world culture. He does say that, although remote, this possibility cannot be entirely disregarded because there are still many highly controversial problems in regard to New World and Old World contacts that remain unresolved. So, turning now to that great resource for all knowledge, Wikipedia. I even found their critical position on horses in the Book of Mormon. Wikipedia would tell you horses are mentioned 14 times in the Book of Mormon and are portrayed as an integral part of the cultures described. There is no evidence that horses existed in the American continent during the 2,500 to 3,000 year history of the Book of Mormon. Horses evolved in North America. That's a big statement, but are believed to have become extinct on the American continent at the end of the Pleistocene. Horses did not reappear in the Americas until the Spanish brought them from Europe. They were brought to the Caribbean by Christopher Columbus in 1493 and to the American continent by Cortez in 1519. Now, this end of the Pleistocene is going to become an important marking point. That is around 10,000 BC, end of the Pleistocene. Okay, so LDS apologists have offered several possible explanations for the horse issue. One of them is that Nephi used a word for horse, his word for horse, to describe a large mammal that he did not have a name for. We know about the origin of, say, for example, our word for hippopotamus, Greek for water horse. I don't think anyone today looking at hippopotamus would immediately think horse. So he does say in 1 Nephi chapter 18, when they arrive at the promised land, there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox, and the ass and the horse, and the goat and the wild goat. And what I'd like to show you here is that instead of actually 6 different animals, he's actually showing 3 major kinds of animals. Ox and a cow are usually gender-specific terms for a bovine. An ass and a horse are very similar animals. And what's the difference between a goat and a wild goat? I wouldn't know. So I think that the names in Hebrew and their meanings that Nephi chose for these animals would be a fascinating study, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about now, which is going to be just horses. So one explanation which I have heard is right here. Baird's tapir. This is Baird's tapir. Currently the largest land animal in Central America. In regions around Oaxaca and Veracruz, it is called the anteburro. In Belize, where it's the national animal, it's called the mountain cow. In Mexico, in the Tzeltal language, it's called semen. In Lacandon, it's called cash itzimin, which means jungle horse. The body mass can be from 330 to 880 pounds. That'll be 150 to 400 kilograms for our friends on the metric system. So, like horses and other hoofed animals, tapirs, actually I'm going to go back here in a moment, but what I'm going to show you, which I can't read, and I'm sure you can't either, is Nephi's description of the animals here, and also some words from Diego de Landa, in which he says that the Mayan word for tapir was tzimin, and that they gave this word to horses, since they had never seen them before, they called horses tzimin as well. And so the question is, what if Nephi and his successors did the same thing, but kind of an opposite? Back to what I was saying here, the Flehmen response is something that hoofed animals exhibit, like horses and others. This is a curling back of the lips to allow for greater smelling or olfactory reception of pheromones. And there's an example of a tapir doing just that. Now this explanation is okay, it makes sense, but it does not win over many opponents of the Book of Mormon, and it seems like we should be able to put forth a better challenge to the critics. What if Nephi and others in the Book of Mormon actually wrote about horses as we would know them? Okay, I've got a series of petroglyphs here. This comes from proceedings of the Oklahoma Academy of Sciences in 1967. These petroglyphs were drawn from Cimarron County, Oklahoma, near the Black Mesa area. The article states that they cannot be dated with certainty, but depictions of horses are rare, and so if it has a horse there, which you can definitely see, that little guy right there, and then, of course, over there, there is a maximum age that these could be. So the question is, what is that age? When would Native Americans have had a horse to be able to do something like that? So I found a good bit of information in a book that was called The Indian and the Horse, written by Frank Gilbert Rowe in 1955. So of course, because it's 1955, he's not going to suggest any outrageous and crazy idea like horses were here before the Europeans came. But his point there was to go through records and see when and how early on Native American tribes had horses. And the problem is that he comes across some very, very early dates, and it's hard to make things work. So taking a look there at what we have, there we go. Okay. Antony Hinde was the first European in some territories of the Sarcee. Hopefully this is what's happening. And this is going to be west of the Hudson Bay. He describes the neighboring tribes, the Blackfoot, as possessing horses in 1754 and being well supplied with them. Just for writing this, he was denounced and deemed as a liar for 20 years until vindicated by the testimony of Matthew Cocking in 1772. So just for saying in 1754 they had horses, he was called a liar. Okay. The sons of La Vendrée made a journey to the Rocky Mountains to see the Mandan tribe in 1742 and 43. They encountered horse tribes there as well. There we go. La Page du Prats, and French is not one of my languages, so I may murder some of these. And others speak about horses, and this is during the exploration in Louisiana, being numerous in the south, and their comment was seemingly different than the European horse. All right. The Snake or the Shoshone had horses probably much earlier than 1700. All right. The Missouri tribe were visited by Henri de Tonty in 1682 and are credited with having horses at that time. I think I may also have something there about the Ute as well. All right. The Tejas are described as in 1684 as being a settled people who raised grain in such abundance that they even fed it to their horses. Is that that's the Missouri, isn't it? All right, hard to see from this angle. Okay, and so there we go. We have as well a group known as the Catakas or the Paducas, the Apache. They were having horse trade with the Arikaras as early as 1680. In Virginia, about 1669, wild horses were a pest. Really? So many wild horses, they were a pest in 1669. The Pawnees are believed to have had horses in 1650 or even in 1630. We also have a statement that it is impossible to determine when the Apaches began using horses other than for food, though very likely it's between 1620 and 1630. Many tribes had horses before 1600s. Among them, we would have the Kiowa and the Pawnee. And Francisco Ibarra, who was in the Sonora Valley in 1567, he says in his account that he finds some of the tribes who were not merely acquainted with the horse, but were practiced horsemen at that time. So we have a very high degree of culture and understanding of the use of the horse at a surprisingly early date. So what's interesting is that we see there from Mexico into what will become the United States, The Spanish expansion stopped after Texas. The reason for that? The Plains tribes already had horses, and that was a major factor. The Spanish horses were no longer the advantage they were with other areas. So the question is, what is the origin of these horses? It is impossible to say when, where, and how these tribes got them. The current thinking is that native groups had dogs and dog sleds before the horses. One account says the dogs actually could drag or carry 75 to 80 pounds. So they could, do quite a bit. But the question is, if the horses only came from Europeans, how did that happen? The first theory that used to be talked about quite a bit was that there were strays. Now, there's no evidence for this. Horses were so important to the Spaniards that they always recorded their fate. And the Spanish never believed that their horses escaped and flourished. The stray theory only works if you have both stallions and mares that escape together, remain together, survive, and breed. And there were a lot of factors against that. Now, there are the three most important Spanish land expeditions with horses, which hold on here, is that what I'm looking for? I guess I am. All right, I'm going to get to that in just a moment here, but what I want to do here is talk about the horse that the natives actually had, and so that would be something that's known as the Indian pony. What's interesting is that the native tribes seem to favor this pinto or paint coloration, something that was actually not favored at all by the Spanish or the Portuguese. That was a type of a breed of horse or coloration that they did not like at all. So the question then is, where do these particular horses come from? There's a problem here with how does this coloration happen? South American wild horses tend to be a solid color, and this pinto coloration is unknown. It tends to be just in the North American areas. Now, this coloration, pinto or piebald, was really, as I said, viewed with contempt by both the Spaniards and Portuguese. In order for there to be pinto horses wild in the Americas, there would have to have been some pintos or multicolored horses brought that successfully bred and reproduced and survived. But the mention of horses like this is actually quite rare. In, for example, 1519, Cortez is described as having 16 horses. 2 of them were described as what could be multicolored to pinto, but no record that there were foals or the Indian were born to them. So, as we see, often wild horses were described by some European settlers as having different traits or different coloration than European horses, even so much that they said it reverted back to the original or the old world wild horses. Some comparison has been made between the Indian pony and very ancient horses, such as the Przewalski from Mongolia, that's a feral horse, and the Polish konik, which is a semi-feral horse. Now, none of these horses would have been a breed that had been brought over by the Spanish, who would have preferred the Arabians and Andalusians. All right, so as far as the idea of, would we have any strays from the Spanish? Panfilo de Narvaez, in 1528, left a port in Cuba trying to reach Havana. But winds blew the fleet into the Gulf of Mexico. He could not reach his port in Cuba. He could not reach the Mexican coast. He eventually landed in Florida. He brought upon 80 horses on his fleet. 42 of them were still alive when they arrived in Florida. 5 months later, only 1 remained. The rest were killed in battle or eaten, and their skulls were later shown to De Soto's party by native guides. Now, it used to be thought that the horses discarded by Hernando de Soto's men in 1541 were the ancestors of all horses west of the Mississippi. Here's what happened to them. The Spanish well knew that there were many dangers that horses would encounter in this new land. Many were killed in battle, many were wounded by buffalo. The Aztec and the Maya initial fear and awe of horses quickly turned into hatred and the ability to kill them in battle rather quickly. So the horse fatalities were noted. In 1539, De Soto left Cuba with 243 horses on board his fleet. 20 died during the voyage. 223 landed on the Florida coast. 3 years later, 150 had died. By 1542, only 40 horses remained. When they decided to cut their losses and escape in 1543, they launched from the lower Mississippi. Their accounts say they took 22 of the good horses, put them on board, and made the rest of them into jerky. Nice, huh? Later, only 4 to 5 remained, stated to all be stallions. They were left behind. By this time, De Soto had died from semi-tropical fever. His successor, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, left behind 4 to 5 horses and says they were killed by natives before the Spanish boats were even out of sight. So that's the fate of the 243 horses that De Soto brought to the New World, and these were originally thought to be the ancestors of all horses west of the Mississippi. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, his force from Mexico went into the U.S. Southwest. Their records state they had 552 horses and 2 mares. Now in Spanish, the word for horse is a masculine word, caballo, and the word for mare is different. So basically what we're saying here is that 552 male horses and 2 mares. Not great odds for reproduction of the species. No geldings are mentioned, but the Spanish soldiers had a preference for stallions of a solid color. They had a saying that multicolored horses were only good for carrying packs. Usually, mares were forbidden as an encumbrance to the expeditions. So this idea of the stray or the escaped horse as being the source of wild horses in the Americas is still used, but from these examples, what are considered the 3 most important Spanish invasions with horses, it's a complete impossibility. The second theory is that natives actually did steal the horses, which did happen. But for considering the usual reactions in fear or hatred of horses, you wouldn't expect stealing to happen right away. So natives who did this must not have only known that horses were useful, but knew how to manage and control them. For example, I know that a cow is useful, but I cannot imagine myself going up to a cow, trying to steal it and take it somewhere. I'd rather just, find my cow wrapped up in a nice package in the meat department. So in Chile, Peru, and Brazil, natives were described as stealing, riding, and breeding horses from 1540. At this point, the records don't show many large numbers of horses imported to South America. Most modern accounts say those numbers are exaggerated. Yet, there are depictions that say wild horses were reported, some provinces being full of them. So again, we have lots of horses very quickly, native familiarity with them in a very short amount of time. How did that all happen? Well, at this point, that's still an open question. Now, the claim has been made by various LDS authors and scholars that horses are seen in Mesoamerican art from time to time. My experience has been these images are sometimes hard to track down, and they're often very subjective. One example we hear a lot is found at Chichen Itza. This is a photograph of mine, and this is actually taken from the Temple of the Wall panels. On its north and south sides, it has blocks carved with scenes of various animals. This is a photo here from the south side, which I took because I knew there was supposed to be a horse, and I couldn't see it from the photo. To help out here, I've got an archaeological drawing, and we can see lots of animals there. There are supposedly squirrels along the bottom row. We've got some jaguars and some flying animals somewhere else as well. I think there's some monkeys over here. Right here is some art that's seen often at Chichen Itza, which is a war captain in a solar disk. Now the item in question is actually right there. So there's the close-up view of it. And there's a little bit of outlining as conservatively as I felt I could do. The idea here is that this is seen by some scholars to be a man standing next to a small horse. So I think it's hard to know for sure. The carving is definitely pre-Columbian, but most of the construction at Chichen dates to the 10th and the 9th centuries AD, long after the close of the Book of Mormon. That would mean that horses, or a knowledge of them, would have to have survived for a long time. Now, if this is not a horse, what other kind of animal would it be? Well, perhaps a tapir, but I'm not sure there. I've spoken with Ted Brewerton about this, and he was interested in this image quite a while ago. Thinks it actually shows someone not standing next to a horse, but riding the horse. And he had a photo he took in 1966 and thought that the entire wall had been removed somewhere else, but it's still there. I took this photo in 1999, so I'm not sure that anything has happened since then. But this is an interesting idea, and they're fascinating. They should not be taken as concrete proof, and I can tell you that they don't convince the critics. So, from time to time, apparently ancient horse teeth or bones have been found in North America, but they were usually dismissed or ignored. Horse and leg bones were included among the fossil collections that were kept by Thomas Jefferson. It's interesting that because everyone knew there were no horses, when they came across the remains, they just ignored them. The existence of ancient indigenous horses in the American continent was only first accepted in 1848, when this happy-looking guy here, Richard Owen, described a fossil horse from South America. Now, he actually was a scientist in London. He was granted the right of first refusal for any freshly dead animal from the London Zoo. His wife once came home to find the carcass of a dead rhino in her front hallway. So life with him must have been very exciting. The first scientific paper on horses in the Americas was published the same year by Joseph Leidy. Okay, that's 1848. Then, and only then, it became acceptable to admit that horses existed on the continent anciently. In fact, as I said, it's now believed that horses, camels, early elephants, and other large animals evolved here first before migrating into Asia and then becoming extinct here for a combination of reasons that's still kind of debated. What was it? Climate change, hunting by early man, disease, or something else? The general answer, and what you'll see people saying now, is that by 10,000 BC, the end of the Pleistocene, that's when all these animals died out. But if you look hard enough, you'll see some respected scientists pushing that date ahead. Ross McPhee, who's curator of mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History, he and his colleagues decided that to do some work around the permafrost on Stevens Village and the banks of the Yukon River. They did some samples where they took sediment samples from the ground and did work on them to test for DNA to find out what the local Alaskan fauna would be. The oldest sediments dated to about 11,000 years ago had DNA of Arctic hare, bison, and moose. All things were found in recent animals, but one core deposit between 7,600 and 10,500 years ago confirmed the presence of both mammoth and horse DNA. So now we're bringing the survival of the horse in the Americas to around 5,600 BC. To make certain there was no contamination, the team did extensive surface sampling around Stevens Village and came up with the same results. So Ross also believes that populations of humans could not have killed all the large animals here, that explanation doesn't do it. He thinks that it would have been disease or pathogens brought in by migrating humans. One of the co-authors of this study says that the fossil record is very incomplete, and just because the most recent remain in the fossil record is from 2,500 years ago, that would be the end of the Pleistocene, that doesn't mean that the horse became extinct at this time. So consider the change in attitude since 1830. It should be recognized on the subject of horses, the Book of Mormon is actually ahead of its time. If it had been written according to the knowledge of the day, you would not have seen horses within its pages. But now we have horse fossils, bones, and teeth from North, Central, and South America. Many varieties of ancient horse are now known that are indigenous to the Americas, including the western horse, Equus occidentalis, the Mexican horse, Equus conversidens, the Yukon horse, Equus lambe, Scots horse, Equus scotti, and the complex tooth horse, Equus complicatus, who would not sit for a drawing, so we'll leave that into our imagination. Some of these varieties were quite large, growing to the size of modern horses. The western horse had a height of 14.5 hands at the shoulder, about the size of a modern Arabian, but had a stockier build. So now let's turn our attention to Mesoamerica. In 1895, Henry Mercer explored 29 caves in the Yucatan, looking for evidence of prehistoric habitation and prehistoric man. And the results of his findings and his work are in the hill caves of Yucatan. He left disappointed because he didn't find what he was looking for. He didn't find ancient man. He didn't find fossils. Most caves had pot shards. They had human refuse and animal bones, including horse and other large remains. He did not attach significance to them because if they were horse, they must have been after the conquest, right? Spanish horses. And most of his finds are forgotten today, but I think they're worth mentioning. There we go. In a cave called Actun Lada, he found 2 horse teeth in the first foot of excavation. In a cave called Saya Actun, he found 2 horse teeth in the second foot of excavation. In Actun Chektale, a horse bone was found also in the second foot of excavation. Other unidentified horse, large mammal bones, and part of a rib were found. Now he called these modern horse and didn't think of them any further. Now it's true that they may be post-conquest. There's been no dating done on them. However, Professor Edward D. Cope has taken a look at these fossils. This was early, back in the end of the 19th century, and has said that they are not modern horse, but upon closer examination, they are the Mexican horse, Equus conversidens, which is supposed to be extinct and only known as fossils. These finds are not fossilized. Now, I was wondering, how long does it take to make a fossil? There is a scientist from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science did some experimentation. He wrote a paper called How to Fossilize a Dinosaur. He said under ideal situations, a dinosaur fossil could be fossilized in only a few years. So back to the Yucatan here. We have this little item here. I first read about this in one of Dr. Lund's books, and I was so surprised by the reference. I looked it up and actually was able to come by my own copy of the Journal of Mammalogy, and Amazon.com is a wonderful thing. So what we have here is in a cenote at Mayapan, and there is a map of Mayapan. Mayapan is a post-classic site that flourished after the collapse of Chichen Itza until about 1814-40. I think it's safe to say at that time there were no horses in the Yucatan or elsewhere in Mesoamerica, but we have some interesting finds that were in a cenote, which is supposed to be right around there, the cenote Chen Mul. There we go. Okay, so according to the Journal of Mammalogy, which was published in 1957, horse remains were found alongside pottery fragments, and judging by their location, degree of mineralization, they're thought to be pre-Columbian. These remains are currently at the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I keep grabbing the wrong item here. There we go, and that's them right there. Very thankfully provided to me by the museum. The photos, not the actual specimens. Wouldn't that be nice? And they are labeled as bottom stratum of unconsolidated earth, black earth, pre-Columbian. So by at least 1957, this was published in the Journal of Mammalogy that there were pre-Columbian horses in the Yucatan. Experts had to admit that there were indeed, that they existed, but they merely said that they were from a pre-Mayan time. Well, what time period would that be? That's left open to a lot of debate. Oddly enough, this information was in the back of the journal sandwiched in between two articles. One was called 3 Additional Records of Antlered Female Deer. The other one was called Longevity of Captive Mammals. Exciting reading. And in between those was pre-Columbian horses from the Yucatan. These remains have all been classified as Equus occidentalis and Equus conversidens, the Mexican horse and the Western horse. They're all now extinct. Still the question is, well, when and why they became extinct remains. So why they evolved here, flourished here for a time, and then became extinct when especially horses flourished here after they were reintroduced, that's something that is still quite a mystery. So I want to talk about another item found right here. I read about references to this book, was able to acquire my own copy of this scientific journal, written all in Spanish, which has to do with excavations in the Loltun Cave in the Yucatan Peninsula. In 1977, 2 lateral extensions of the Loltun Cave, they're in this part called the Huechil Grotto. The 2 digs were called El Tunel and El Toro. They were described by Peter Schmidt of Ina, and the results, he says, are problematic and complicated. Why are they problematic and complicated? Very few details of these findings have been published. Most come from the information in El Toro. Now, the scientific paper has a big description of what they found and where, and so I tried to take it all and make a graphic of it so I could understand it visually. And that's what I have there. Hopefully you can see that. So when you do the excavations, you have various levels, and they're labeled 1 to level 16. They represent the cave's chronology. So we have level 1 here, and down to level 16 right down there. So we have El Tunel and El Toro, graphs of 2 different digs there. So here is the problem. Bones and bony fragments of Pleistocene megafauna were found in most of El Toro's levels. And they've done some radiocarbon dating. The only published radiocarbon dating was from levels, between levels 7 and 8. So kind of right around there. And right around there. The radiocarbon dating is 1805 BC, with an error of plus or minus 150 years, well after the Ice Age, well after the Pleistocene. This is not all. Dr. Schmidt says, sadly, 44 horse bone fragments have been recovered from levels 7 to levels 2. So that's from here on upward. All supposedly from earlier time periods and also containing classic and pre-classic ceramics. His article ends by saying, something has happened in Loltun that is still hard to explain. The survival of extinct animals like the Mexican horse may need to be extended to the beginnings of the ceramic era, which he says would not please paleontologists. So this information here is not completely unknown. Critics of the Book of Mormon have come across it, and they mention how the article talks about rodents and how the rodents tunnel through various layers, and that could have moved bones up and down. You like that? And so what's interesting is that while that's mentioned in the reports, Peter Schmidt never says he thinks that's what happened. If he thought that was what happened, he probably would have said that this is problematic and it's complicated. In fact, on a website dedicated to proving the Book of Mormon wrong by trying to explain away these things here, I found a quote from Peter Schmidt, 1988, in which he says, the presence of Pleistocene Equus conversidens in ceramic layers has been interpreted as possible proof of the survival of the extinct horse into the Holocene. The Holocene is the period in which we are right now. It came after the Pleistocene. So this is what I would call hard evidence. In fact, bones and hard fossils like that are pretty hard. So the critics aren't too impressed by this. I was kind of impressed. But they do have something to say that sometimes LDS apologists may have been overzealous in their interpretation of these findings. This doesn't really help our cause. I think we need to be cautious about the evidence that we accept and support, especially in controversial areas, and I am always cautious about the types of things I look for and share, and I feel pretty safe in sharing what I have now. Now, as far as other examples of horse, there we go. I've been in contact with some professors from BYU. Since about 2000, Dr. Stephen Jones, formerly of BYU, has been working with Dr. Wade Miller from the BYU Department of Geology and INA archaeologist Joaquin Arroyo Cabrales. And they were trying to find ancient horse remains and conclusively date them with radiocarbon dating. In an unpublished paper that Dr. Jones co-authored with Dr. Miller and shared with me some of their initial findings. Out of 45 equa samples they tested from Mexico, he says that 38 had insufficient collagen for accelerator mass spectrometry dating. One was from the Ice Age, and others were after the Spanish Conquest. However, from North American samples, they have a horse bone from Pratt Cave near El Paso, Texas, dated from 6020 to 5890 BC. Now, given what the findings are that we have from the sediments and the DNA testing in Alaska, this is not a problem at all. Another specimen from Wolf Spider Cave in Colorado, dated from AD 1260 to 1400. A bone from the Horse Thief Cave in Wyoming, dated to 1100 BC. Most of these dates were obtained through AMS dating, and that's accelerator mass spectrometry if you're interested, but the wolf spider specimen's date was obtained through thermoluminescent methods. So one problem in dating some of these ancient samples seems to be insufficient collagen, and they're still working at trying to do more of this. So we can see there is some pretty decent evidence. Oh, go back one. There we go. Pretty good evidence to say that there were horses here much longer than has previously been thought. Now, I think it's safe to say that there were no horses in the Yucatan by perhaps the Maya post-classic period. But what if there were some horses that survived in remote areas, remote enough and small enough numbers that they were not noticed by Spanish conquerors or other European settlers? Here's a possibility. This is a breed known as the Bashkir curly, sometimes called the North American curly. It's unusual not only for its curly hypoallergenic coat, but its origins as well. It's called the Bashkir because it's believed it came from a region in Russia. However, that region does not have curly-coated horses, and there's no record of importation from that area of Russia to the Pacific Northwest. There's no genetic connection either. There's a breed called the Lokai in Tajikistan that sometimes has a curly coat. So the North American curly could have descended from this or other Asian breeds. In the 1800s, Charles Darwin noted curly horses in South America, long before any known documentation of their transportation from Asia. So we have no connection at all we can make between curlies in the Americas and the Bashkirs in Russia. It's still a mystery, and what's interesting is that there's even some speculation outside the LDS community among horse experts that perhaps curlies crossed over the Bering Land Strait anciently and survived here in the Americas until modern times. And because of that, there is a move to change their name from the Bashkir curly to the North American curly. So my question is, could these be remnants of Nephi's horses? In the end, this is not incontrovertible evidence, but I think it's worth considering. As I said, I have no smoking gun. I believe there's a reason we don't have that. There's a reason that we've never found a gold plate written in Reformed Egyptian that says, "Welcome to Zarahemla, signed King Benjamin." And the reason, I think, is this. In Alma 31, chapter 31, verse 17, Alma teaches, "Yea, there are many who do say, if thou wilt show unto us a sign from heaven, then we will know of a surety, then we shall believe." Now I ask, is this faith? Behold, I say unto you, nay, for if a man knoweth a thing, he hath no cause to believe, for he knoweth it. He also says now in verse 22, "I would that ye should remember, God is merciful unto all who believe on his name. Therefore, he desireth in the first place that ye should believe, yea, even on his word. Brothers and sisters, my hope is that we believe on his word, on the Book of Mormon, and that belief will lead us to greater areas. And perhaps things like this will help our belief. So I appreciate your time here. As was mentioned, actually a good bit of what I've talked about can be found in the caves of Loltun, from the journey of myself and my co-authors to the Yucatan Peninsula. And thank you for your time.